In this story, I'm going to tell you how I exposed a predator hiding in the youth shelter where I teach restorative arts, how I stopped being gentle and secretly built a case to protect the teens. But I didn't go to the people who'd already shrugged it off or stage a dramatic public confrontation. I used his own charm as the trap, baited him into showing who he really was, and what he said and did in that moment destroyed everything he'd been hiding. I'm Evelyn Marlowe, 34, and I live in Portland, Oregon. I teach restorative arts at a small community center downtown: pottery, printmaking, soft sculpture, the kinds of classes that coax people into opening up without asking too much of them. Most days my life looks quiet and ordinary. I walk the same routes past a neon-faded donut shop, a barista who knows my order by heart, and a second-hand bookstore whose bell still rings when the door opens. I plan lessons on centering clay and mending torn lino cuts, and I keep my tiny rental apartment tidy enough that there's always room for the clay I fire in the little kiln on my balcony. I'm good at seeing what's broken and making it beautiful again. People call me gentle. I let them. That gentleness is a kind of armor, soft on the outside, but stubborn as granite inside. I have always been the person who notices the small, important things. A glaze running wrong, a student holding back their hands, the way a teenager folds their jacket tighter when they feel exposed. For months, I'd been mentoring a group of teenagers from a nearby shelter as part of the center's outreach program. We'd pull a battered bus table into the studio, set out tools, and talk about ways to shape pieces of ourselves into something we could set down without hurting anyone else. We laughed a lot. We fought with clay. We celebrated when a fragile bowl came out of the kiln intact. Teaching them felt like work that mattered in a way the rest of my days rarely did. One of those kids was Mia. She was quick, a little skeptical, and brilliant with a slab roller. We watched her learning curve like proud parents. Then the shelter hired a new counselor, Derek. He had the kind of charm that slides over people like oil, confident laugh, the right kind of jokes, expensive sneakers that whispered discretion. He showed up offering to help arrange weekend activities, shuttle kids to events, and bolster the shelter's volunteer roster. At first, he seemed like an answer. I trusted him, he seemed to care. But trust can be a slow currency to spend, and the interest rate on lies is high. Small things crept in and started to sour the picture. Derek began taking credit for ideas I'd carefully developed for art projects, as if he'd had the flash of inspiration himself. He started making offhand comments about the teens in our program, that some of them were more likely to cause trouble, that others were best kept at a distance because of family backgrounds. He would turn up at pickup times unannounced, sometimes alone with parents, and his presence felt less like help and more like surveillance. The final hinge was the night Mia told me, in a whisper thick with fear, that Derek had come into her room at the shelter to check on her and had tried to get too close. She froze when he touched her shoulder, then pretended to be asleep. She didn't tell the staff, she didn't trust they would listen. I reported it immediately to the shelter director and to the city youth services line. Paperwork was filed. But the director, who had already taken to Derek's loud, ingratiating manner, brushed it off as a misunderstanding and later, bafflingly, wrote him a glowing recommendation when he applied for an expanded role. He praised Derek as an involved caregiver. Nothing happened. The system, formal reports, polite interviews, bureaucratic checkboxes, moved like molasses around a smiling man. I felt sick with the knowledge that a predator might still be walking free around the teens I watched over. That realization lit a slow, steady burn inside me. My gentleness shifted. It stopped being a shield and became a tool. I was tired of being the woman who nodded and moved on. I was tired of trusting the machinery that protected charm over children. If the system would not act, I would. I would be precise, I would be careful, and I would be relentless. Derek's charm had edges I caught like splinters. He arrived at sessions carrying crates of juice boxes and a Bluetooth speaker that made the room feel louder, like an intrusion. He laughed too easily at the teens' jokes and lingered when parents picked up, offering to help carry bags or to drive someone home. Small favors, but the kind that buy you trust. I started keeping an inventory in my head, which kids he hovered near, what he said in hushed tones, who flinched when he came close. Mia's discomfort became a knot I couldn't ignore. She changed the way she sat when he was around, arms folded tight, knees tucked in. Once, after he left, I found a folded paper in the art room with her handwriting. I don't like him. It was a literal, bright plea. Memory blurred into investigation. I remembered Derek at my first meeting: polished shoes, tailored jacket, a confident handshake, and how quickly he'd inserted himself. He volunteered for weekend hikes and open studio nights, always present at the edges where supervision was thin. When I confronted him politely about taking credit for a mixed media project idea, he smiled, said I was modest, and sent an email to the director praising both of us. The director copied me in, and the praise turned my complaint into a footnote. That small victory for him hardened into a pattern. At home, too, the case pulled at me. I would sit at my kitchen table, clay-stained hands around a mug, replaying Mia's whisper. The city's hotline confirmation number sat on my counter like a challenge. I made a list: dates, times, witnesses, how a predator constructed access, kindness, small inside jokes, the illusion of protection. I thought about the shelter director's laugh when I presented concerns. He trusted Derek, he said. Trusted him for what? A clean background check and a winning smile. The whisper of bureaucracy became a braying wall. That night I dreamed of the teens as fragile ceramics on a high shelf and Derek's shadow as a careless hand. I woke with clay under my nails and a clarity that gentleness without action could be a betrayal. I would not be merely kind, I would be precise. If the system preferred polite words to truth, then I would assemble evidence they couldn't ignore. I promised Mia I would make sure her voice mattered, even if I had to scrape it out myself, like trimming a flawed pot until it held together. The slow burn in my chest was no longer simply anger, it became a plan. Because of their family backgrounds, I felt a penny drop in my chest every time he said it, and one night Mia told me in a whisper that Derek had come into her room at the shelter to check on her. It sounded innocuous at first. He said he wanted to make sure I was okay, she murmured, but the way she kept her knees drawn up to her chest and the way her hands trembled told me the rest. She described how he'd leaned in when she tried to get up, how he'd put a hand on her shoulder to steady her and stayed there too long. She told me he'd asked about her past in a way that made her feel like an exhibit under a glass lamp, asking about old bruises and who she stayed with and whether anyone came to visit. She didn't use the word assault, she didn't need to. Her silence filled the room like a held breath. I had to swallow the urge to hug her until her shoulders unknotted. Later that week, I lay awake thinking of every interaction I'd had with Derek and seeing them in a different light. The quick hugs that lasted a beat too long, the way he'd joke about protecting the kids, the nights he volunteered to stay late and lock up. Those little casual invasions stacked up into a pattern. He depositioned himself as the adult who knew how to navigate bureaucracy, and people liked that confidence. People trusted confidence. It made me wonder how many other soft corners he'd edged into unnoticed. I remember the first time I'd felt a flash of real unease. He came to the community center with a box of hand-me-down shoes and lingered by the ceramics table while I worked with a nervous boy named August. He commented on my posture like it was a flirtation and told the teens stories about rough places he'd come from, the implication always that he'd saved himself. He spoke loud enough to be earnest, but not loud enough for staff to question him. In the moment, it seemed like background noise, another adult with theatrical humility, until Mia's whisper reshaped every memory. Reporting him felt necessary and impossible at once. The forms were procedural and antiseptic, but the shelter director's face when I mentioned the complaint said what the signed paperwork never would: an immediate tendency to shield a man who was useful. He waved away the words with a practiced smile and said, "We can't make accusations on hearsay." His loyalty to Derek was wrapped up in gratitude and convenience. Derek had filled gaps in staffing and made himself indispensable. I left feeling small and dangerous, like I'd knocked a piece from the foundation and no one else had felt the rumble. That rumble hardened into resolve. I began to pay attention, to not take Derek's casual statements at face value. I kept a notebook: dates, times, who else was around, exact phrases Derek used. I asked the kids to tell me details about any contact that made them uncomfortable and reminded them quietly that I believed them. It was the gentleness inside me that taught me how to coax truth out of fear, to create a space where a whispered confession could live and be taken seriously. But gentleness alone felt inadequate. If the system would look the other way, then I would have to be precise, methodical, and unrelenting. The slow burn inside me was no longer just anger, it was a plan starting to take shape. I shouldn't have waited, I told myself that as I stood outside Mia's sheltered door, the fluorescent light humming in the hallway, painting everything a tired, sickly blue. Check on her. It was a small sentence, an ordinary instruction, but it felt enormous when the shelter's thin walls seemed thinner than ever. I pushed my palm to the door and let the memory of her whisper find me. He came into my room. The words pulsed like a light in my ribs. They had nowhere to hide. I could still hear the hush of her voice, the way her jaw clenched around a secret that had no safe place to land. I knocked once, then again, softer. The staff at the shelter kept odd hours. Sometimes the night volunteers slept in the common room, sometimes they walked the floor in loops. Tonight the footsteps were absent, only the muffled TV and someone's late laugh drifting from a different wing. The door opened a crack. Mia blinked at me, eyes hollowed by something that made her look older than 17. She let me in the smallest of ways, an invitation that could be closed at the first wrong breath. Her bed was a tangle of thrift store blankets, a poster taped unevenly above it. Her hands trembled when she pulled at the edge of a sleeve. She said she was fine, then said it again with the same thinness as the paper walls. I sat on the foot of her bed because there wasn't much else to do in rooms like this but become present. I asked small questions about school, about art, because the big ones had the power to make her vanish into herself. When I asked about Derek, her lips tightened. She told me he'd offered to take her out for coffee, that he'd stayed after a mentoring night to talk. She said he'd put his hand on her shoulder and then lingered there, his fingers light, testing. She had frozen like a bird in a room with a window that won't open. She refused to file a complaint. She was frightened of retaliation, of being labeled difficult, of losing the fragile stability of the shelter. I felt a hot, helpless surge at the injustice. My hands were clay-stained and my nails dusted with kiln ash. I thought about molding something into a better shape for her, but there was no clay in that moment that could make this right. So I did the only thing I believed in. I became steady. I told her she didn't have to decide now. I told her I believed her. I promised to be there tomorrow. My voice was a rope thrown into dark water. Before I left, I smoothed the blanket at her feet like a small benediction. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and lemon air freshener, efforts to sanitize more than surfaces. I walked back to my car and felt the city's night breathe around me. The streetlights pooled like watchful eyes. Check on her. The sentence looped, precise and relentless. I decided I would, and that I would do more than sit on the edge of the bed. I would keep watch in ways the paperwork hadn't. I would learn the edges of Derek's smile and the hours he liked to be alone with the teens. I would learn the weak places where the shelter's armor wouldn't hold. That night I wrote notes in my phone, tiny bullet points that felt like school supplies for a quieter kind of fight. Call the director again, ask for camera reports, speak to volunteers. I knew the system might fail her, the director already had, but not knowing would feel worse than failing. I folded my promise into my pocket and let it warm there like a coin. Tomorrow I would check on her again, and the day after. And had tried to get too close. She was 17 and she froze when he touched her shoulder. She did not tell the staff because she did not trust they would listen. I reported it immediately to the shelter director and to the city youth services line. Paperwork was filed that week, but the shelter director, who had grown fond of Derek quick and loud, brushed it off as a misunderstanding. It came out later he had written a glowing recommendation for Derek when he applied for an expanded role, calling him an involved caregiver. Nothing happened, and I felt sick with the knowledge that a predator might still be walking free around the teens I looked after. That started a slow burn inside me, the sense that the system was ready to protect a man with the right words and the right smile while leaving the kids to protect themselves. I was tired of being gentle and doing nothing. I needed to act, and I needed to be precise. I began to look back through the months like a detective rewatching old footage. Small things that had once seemed like quirks snapped into focus. The way Derek always positioned himself between the kids and the front desk, the casual way he lingered after lights out to check the locks, the way he knew which teens had a history of running and which preferred to hide. He had a map of vulnerabilities in his head, and he used it like a cartographer. I made a list, dates, times, offhand comments. I sketched out the routes he took from the shelter to the bus stop. I started arriving early to sessions and leaving late, staying close enough to hear but careful not to spook anyone. It felt like walking a line between vigilance and obsession, and some nights I lay awake thinking I'd crossed it. Memory kept returning to me as face, to the roundness of her eyes when she refused to meet mine and whispered that Derek had come into her room. She tried to make it sound small, like she was making trouble. The shelter's own rules said staff should never be alone with a teen behind closed doors. The written policy glittered on laminated posters in the common room. But policies had no teeth without people willing to enforce them. That realization hardened me. I could hand the case to authorities and hope. Or I could make sure there was an unassailable trail, a set of facts so precise that even a director fond of charm couldn't disguise them. So I started to build evidence in the only ways available to me. I coaxed the teens into telling me more, not with interrogation but with art, a clay exercise on boundaries, a printmaking prompt about safe spaces. Conversations flowed from the projects, a line in a drawing, a sudden silence that told me more than words. Sitting with them, I learned names of places Derek liked to take kids on one-on-one outings, the way he favored a particular bench in the park where the shadows fell early. I learned that he always carried the same coffee cup from a nearby shop, that he kept his keys in a thin leather pouch clipped to his belt. These details felt petty and intimate and vital, like stitches to mend a torn garment. Collecting them changed me. Where once I patched ceramics with gentle hands, I found myself filing, noting, compiling. I told myself it was for protection. The truth was I was trying to make sense of how kindness could coexist with predation. Friends noticed the strain, my tone clipped at our pottery circle, my eyes darting sometimes when a man in a hoodie passed the studio. "You're carrying the weight of these kids," Margaret said, pressing flour-dusted palms into mine. "Don't let it eat you." But I couldn't let it go. Not when a system that should have been a net was, in my view, full of holes. I planned for precision, no dramatic confrontations, no vigilante theatrics. I would gather enough small, undeniable things that a complaint could not be folded into affection or brushed away as misunderstanding. The slow burn in my chest grew into a steady heat that focused my days into careful, deliberate action. I was gentle by nature, but gentleness could shield ferocity when the moment called for it. And for these kids, I decided the moment had come.